Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to today's talk. Good morning or afternoon or late evening stroke night, wherever you are. The Centre for India and South Asia, CISA, at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Stavanger, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land grant institution, UCLA, we pay our respects to the Honuk Vetum, the ancestors, the Ahihiram, the elders, and Eu Hinkam, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. Today's talk is part of the Centre for India and South Asia, CISA's regular seminar series. And I would like to thank Bharat Venkat, who is a co-organizer of this series with myself for this year and last year, and Akhil Gupta, who is the director of CISA. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to Jamaica Villegas, who has been doing all the kind of setting up administrative work for this series, this talk included. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to welcome today our speaker, Anuja Agrawal. She's professor at the Department of Sociology, the Delhi School of Economics at the University of Delhi. She has written on a wide range of issues, especially in the fields of family, kinship, marriage, and gender studies, and has focused hugely on India's denotified, semi-nomadic, and nomadic communities, which is what she's going to be talking on today. She's the author of the book Chaste Wives and Prostitute Sisters, Patriarchy and Prostitution Among the Bediyas of India, which is on one of these denotified communities, and incredibly meticulous, in-depth work, a really remarkable ethnography on an extremely understudied sector of the population, also one of the most marginal sectors of the Indian population, the denotified communities. She's also the editor of Migrant Women and Work, and she's currently working on a book on family studies in a series by Professor Sujata Patel. So thank you so much for being here, Anuja, and we're really looking forward to your talk. So we will, Anuja will speak, and then we'll have a chance for Q&A at the end. People will be able to put a question in the Q&A, and then we will be able to invite you to unmute yourselves and also speak your question out. You know, we can put you on video as well. But at the moment, the chat is disabled, and people are not can't present themselves on video, but we will be able to for the questions. So really looking forward to your talk, Anuja, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Anna. I would like to thank the UCLA Center for India and South Asia for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I would especially like to thank both Anna and Bharat for organizing this series and for giving me a chance to speak from this platform about a most marginalized section of Indian society. Just give me 1 second. So in the my talk will have 2 parts. In the first part of my talk, I will be outlining some of the broader characteristics of the communities who are the focus of my presentation. And I will talk of some of the major issues which confront them under the present circumstances. This is necessary in order to contextualize the second part of my presentation, which will be focusing upon gender relationships in these groups. And subsequent to that, I will be also speaking a little bit about the Bediya community, which is one of the groups that I am most familiar with. In most parts of the world, and almost universally at some stage in human history, some people have led a nomadic existence. Even with increasing sedentarization of large segments of human population, nomadism has continued to prevail, especially among those who pursue a pastoral mode of life and others whose activities require them to be mobile. While pastoral communities are nomadic, owing to the needs to forage for land where their animals can be fed, the non-pastoral, peripatetic or itinerant groups have engaged in trades which cannot be sustained through residence in a fixed place. And in fact, they are useful precisely because of their mobility. In India, at a time when modern means of transport and communication had not developed, the only way some of the remote communities could access essential commodities like salt and grain was through such itinerant traders, also called service nomads, who would visit their villages at regular intervals. Many healers and entertainer groups, including some who have kept animals like monkeys, snakes, bears, also led a wandering existence and earned their livelihood by providing medicinal herbs or by entertaining the villagers as well as townspeople, especially during fairs and festivals. A number of religious mendicants, fakirs, or sannyasis have also led such a wandering lifestyle outside the mainstream rural and urban society in India. Such nomadic specialists have played an important role in society without ever being fully integrated in it. Although they are sometimes equated with Dalits or the so-called untouchable castes, and in fact maybe even treated like them, at other times, they are also seen as tribes, but I would suggest that there is a need to see them through a different lens. And this is something I could elaborate further if people want. The important point is that those pursuing a nomadic or even semi-nomadic lifestyle in India and elsewhere have a long history of being treated with suspicion and fear by settled populations. And as I said, India is not an exception to this rule. The animosity towards these people arises from their very different relationship to work, the assumptions about their lax morals, the ideas about their abhorrence of labor, as well as the stigma attached to the idea that they are engaged in criminal activities. Such prejudices have often been extended to nomadic groups in other parts of the world as well, the Roma gypsies of Europe being a notable and comparable instance. In Indian context, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 and its subsequent avatars, which were enacted in 1897, 1911, 1924, played a very significant role in accentuating the stigma and marginalization of several such nomadic groups. It's sometimes assumed in popular literature that all communities which eventually came under the net of the Criminal Tribes Act were notified in 1871. That's not true. Actually, it's some of these subsequent versions of the Criminal Tribe Act which notified them. Anyway, I'll not go into the history of this because it has also been very well documented, but we cannot really talk about these groups without a reference to the Criminal Tribes Act. So this notorious act notified a large segment of these groups and rendered them as criminals by birth, which also also enforce many restrictions on their activities and mobility. A lot of this has been very well documented in a vast social science literature. Now, these are the groups which are now referred to as denotified communities because the Criminal Tribes Act was repealed in 1952, that is after 5 years of Indian independence. In fact, that this happened 5 years after India became independent remains a very sore point among denotified communities in India, and there has been increasing momentum among these communities to celebrate independence on 31st August, which is when this denotification occurred, rather than on 15th August, as is true for the rest of the country. So they feel that they've been treated as separate right from the beginning. Now, although not all nomadic and semi-nomadic communities were notified under the CTA, that is the Criminal Tribes Act, even in its various versions, these different segments, that is to say nomadic and semi-nomadic and denotified communities, share enough characteristics with those who are technically denotified, for us to treat them together for analytic purposes as well as for policy making purposes. They are treated together for policy making purposes as well. By some estimates, this is almost 10% of Indian population. We don't have very clear estimates about their population. And again, this is something for the reasons for which we could discuss separately if people are interested. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that the groups that are classified under the denotified, nomadic, or semi-nomadic rubrics are not always separate and discrete entities, even though they are sometimes treated as such in both academic and policy literature. Now, this is not something which is always apparent to outsiders, again, for various reasons, including the fact that such connections are not openly admitted to by members of these communities as well. But if one probes deep enough, one finds that such communities see themselves as historically, culturally, especially linguistically, socially in terms of relationships of marriage, politically in terms of sharing something like a common panchayat. They see themselves as linked to each other in many complex ways. So when you see a list of denotified and nomadic communities, you will find lots of terms. If you look at reports by the national commissions which have been set up for these people, they have long lists of these communities. But each of the terms which are being used as reference for such groups in these kind of official documents or in journalistic reports or even in common parlance actually refer to social entities of quite different types. And in fact, a single set of people can be identifying with multiple such identities depending upon the context. And this is not, of course, unique to these communities, but it is less recognized, I think, in the context of these communities. So for example, a term like Bhatu or Bhatu has come to refer to specific denotified groups in the policy literature. However, the term also refers to a broad category used by many people in these communities to distinguish themselves often from the mainstream population. So there is this distinction of like a we or they. So the non-insiders would be referred to by the term Kaja, for instance. And this is very similar to how the Roma gypsies also refer to their own groups and to outsiders. The term Kaja actually is also found among the gypsies. So the term Bhatu may be a common term referring to a large segment of these communities among themselves. And I just like to share, a little bit here to make this so if you look at this genealogy, this is something which is found on one of the websites which is maintained by members of these groups. And you can see how they represent themselves as linked with each other. Now, this is, of course, in Hindi. There may be people here who cannot read Hindi, but this says Bhatu Samaj is divided into two big groups, the Bhatus and the Sasis. And then further, these groups are further divided into multiple other groups, including the Kanjar, the Nat, the Bachra, the Bedia, many other groups. So I'm not going to read it all out. But essentially, you can see here that these groups are identifying themselves with a common term like Bhatu, and they are also using other terms of reference. And this is something like this is openly available on a website which they maintain. It's a public statement about who they are as a group. So this sort of complex kind of identifications are now, let us say, openly acknowledged by these people. But these kind of complex processes of identification are never captured by the large-scale documentary practices of the state. And owing to the logic of such exercises, such groups also tend to accommodate their different identifications into whatever frameworks are available to them, which gives the impression that there are a number of discrete and distinct groups. This understanding is also reinforced because such identifications are not always openly acknowledged to outsiders. Elsewhere in my other works, my work on the Bedias, where I confronted this kind of a broader sense of identification that these people have, so I've argued that several such groups can be seen as forming a cluster of interrelated communities, at least at the regional level. In fact, we don't know so much about these kind of clusters, and we don't know whether all groups are part of such clusters, whether there are multiple such clusters. And I think this is really a matter for further research. Instead of seeing these as, so many small groups, what are the broader entities that they are part of, how they are interlinked? This is not an easy area of research, but I think there is very little that we understand about these kind of broader groups into which these people are embedded. Now with over the last, say, 10, 15 years, with the setting up of several successive national commissions, specifically addressing the issues of these communities. The first one was set up in 2006, Balkrishna Renke Commission, then which submitted its report in 2008, and then the other commission, which was set up in 2015 under Bhiku Ramidate, and it submitted its report in 2018. More and more NT or DNT or denotified and nomadic groups are seeking to forge broader alliances for political purposes. So again, this is something that we can see. For instance, this is just scraps from one of their pamphlets, where you can see at the bottom, again, this is in Hindi. I apologize to people who cannot read this, but you can see that it says, Sasi Bhedput Kanjar Bhat Bhatu Chara Naam Anek Jati Ek. That is what it says. So many names, but one caste. This is the statement which is made at the bottom of this pamphlet. And so the point is that many such more attempts at forging a common identity are evident at present. Many such groups are also now active on WhatsApp and on Facebook, and there are many new kinds of politics around large-scale identity formations, which are, however, I don't think very well documented and analyzed. So this is just a pointer of what is going on. On the other hand, so there are these kind of things which are moving towards larger scale identity, some of which have existed, some of which are new. But on the other hand, this idea that there are discrete groups may seem appropriate when we consider the geographically isolated or marginal characteristic of the residence pattern of these people. So most of these people, most of the DNT, NT groups tend to live in small hamlets or temporary settlements, usually on the fringes of towns and villages. So across North India and Central India, with which I'm most familiar, you come across many Kanjar bastis, Sansi bastis, Sapera bastis, Pardi bastis, Kalakar colonies, Katputli colonies, etc., which are essentially made up of residents of these communities, one or more at times. The Bedia hamlet in which I did my field work so many years ago was also a settlement of this kind. We don't have any official count of such groupings at either a larger level or at a local level. And again, the residents of these habitats also share many ties with others like them elsewhere. But for the day-to-day life, it is a very significant unit. Most of the DNTs and NT communities are in fact deprived of access to secure housing and land rights and tend to live in such more or less permanent ghettoized settings. In urban areas, the new imaginaries of the city have also strongly impacted their habitats, and many urban settlements of such groups have had to relocate due to changing value of real estate. Katputli colony in Delhi, which was a 50-year-old settlement of nomadic groups from Rajasthan. So there's been a tendency for all nomadic groups to become settled. So something like this was settled as part of that. So this colony was made up of groups like Gadia, Lohar, Sapera, etc. But this is one of the most recent example of how such colonies are also don't have a permanent status, and they were removed from the place which they had now come to call their home. So there are a lot of such issues that I would say that this kind of insecure sort of pattern of residence is also at the source of a lot of problems that many of the denotified and nomadic groups are facing. So a lot of them live in these kind of settings. So despite, for instance, the repealment of the Criminal Tribes Act, the members of these kind of peripheral settlements continue to be stigmatized and disproportionately targeted by the law enforcement agencies whenever there is a crime committed in the neighboring areas. And there are frequent reports of these kind of things. So there are many laws so while the Criminal Tribes Act was repealed, there are other laws which mimic some of the provisions that law had, and allow a police which is anyway very prejudiced against such groups, and also are looking for people they can scapegoat whenever they are forced, under pressure to solve a crime. So these groups tend to be the first to be targeted. And this is something that has been documented by many civil society groups. There are a lot of harrowing experiences of these communities. And there are instances of custodial deaths. There are cases of suicides. There is a lot of this, and this is reported with uncanny regularity, which is a very, very, and it's media, mainstream media remains also very insensitive to these kind of things. So most recently, a very nice group called the Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project, which has been started by young lawyers in Bhopal. They have also highlighted the disproportionate incarceration of DNT communities. And this is something I've written about, and I can elaborate also later on, that we don't have clear data. None of these things we have good data on. So it's also a problem to make claims like these. And that there is a problem of invisibility over here. So the constant threat of police raids and violence has many serious implications also for the women in such groups, because they end up being the ones who have to deal with the police whenever there is a raid, and there is a fear that there will be a raid. And many such cases are there. And if you look up, search in the newspapers, you would find that there are such cases happening all the time. The high rates of incarceration of men of these groups also translate into greater impoverishment of the women and children, and also a higher presence of women-headed households. Another visible trend and that you can see is that these groups are targeted by other sedentary communities, not just the police, but other sedentary communities who detest their existence in their neighborhood. And there are documented instances of vigilante groups from sedentary populations attacking them, and usually as a response to suspicions about threat and petty crimes. So very recently, for instance, in January 2021, there was such a case of villagers from a Ratlam district in Madhya Pradesh attacking a Kanjar village in Rajasthan, Jhalawar district. And because the men had fled, 38 women and children were kidnapped by the villagers from Ratlam. And of course, in this particular case, the police did intervene and the women and children were rescued. But the villagers, when a police action was taken against them, the MLAs, etc., from their region came in their support rather than in the support of the people who were attacked and kidnapped. So this is the sort of thing that there is a lot of tolerance for violence, and those who attack actually claim to be the victims rather than those who are attacked. So apart from this kind of very serious consequences of continued stigma owing to this idea of criminality which continues to stigmatize these people, the bigger problem is also about the inadequate integration of these people in the modern economy. I wouldn't say this is the bigger problem. I mean, it's an equal problem. So even sectors which could utilize their very valuable skills at times do not integrate these people. And there are, this is a very big issue. So some of this has become more of a problem because of, again, a set of new laws which criminalize the former activities of such groups. So for instance, the wildlife protection laws have criminalized all groups which survived on by keeping animals like saperas, madaris, etc. And many of these communities actually feel very shortchanged. So for instance, very briefly, if I was to mention the saperas, who believe or who feel that they and their culture is very often used to showcase Indian culture abroad. And at home, however, they have absolutely no, no position. So there is some amount of documentation about these people. Their Kalbelia dance, for instance, is recognized by the UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of India. And, so there is a lot of valorization of this kind of culture that they have, but there is no recognition that they get back at home. So in fact, there are many sapera bastis in Delhi also. And you see that these people are scrambling again for their livelihood by doing all kind of things, which of course don't necessarily, they're not very well paying. Again, this is in Hindi, so you would see that they are trying to play bands at wedding parties or play the bean. Bean is this instrument that it's also called pungi, I think, which the saperas are, no, it's an Indian musical instrument. So they would offer to play these at wedding parties, etc. But really, in fact, if you visit their homes, they're still keeping all of them, even though it is illegal. So of course, this is done, you can say, in a clandestine manner, but all of them have not given up keeping the snake. So you can see these baskets, which are, and it's a thing, that here you see them being kept on a charpai or a chair. So there's a lot of respect with which these communities treat their animals. And there is a lot of sense of, betrayal. So this man whom we talked to was the chief of the Sapera Basti. I'd gone there as a part of a group. He would say, Sir se Sapera, but see how we are treated. Now, the Sir se Sapera means that in India, when the alphabet is taught to children, the word Sir stands for Sapera. That means, so this is something which the community members mention as an indicator of how central they are to Indian culture, that even language is taught by saying Sir se Sapera. However, see how we are treated. So this is just one example of, this kind of, you can say, perception of betrayal that these people suffer from. And there are many examples of how, in the modern context, such people are unable to survive. So can I just get a sense of how much time do I have, Jamaica?
It's Anna here. You're fine. You can speak for another, 15, 20 minutes.
Okay.
Easily,
All right. So,
or even a little more. Yeah.
okay. Right. Okay. So there are, like each category, each set of people have their own different set of problems. And some of these have also got accentuated due to the COVID pandemic and the lockdown. And many civil society groups have been documenting these, including a series of documentaries which have been made by the Bhutan theater people. But apart from that, even under normal, so-called normal conditions, there is a lot of problems as far as the economic aspect are concerned. And these problems have only got multiplied due to, as I said, for instance, emergence of malls and gated communities in urban areas, which no longer allow such people inside them, their, boundaries. So in my own lifetime, I have seen that as a child, we could see many people from these kind of backgrounds openly plying their trades in our residential areas, but this is now something which is not possible at all. So for instance, Waghari women who who exchange clothes for utensils were a common visitor in earlier times. Even now in villages, you may find them, but no gated communities would allow such communities to enter them. In certain cases, so many of these people, for instance, would travel long distances to beg, and the Behrupia, for instance, is such a community. And now there have been some recent cases where such people have been mob lynched because of suspicions that they are child kidnappers. And so such suspicions have circulated on WhatsApp groups, etc. And these people have become victims of these kind of rumors. So there is a lot of this sort of problems related to livelihood that we need to keep in mind. But we also need to remember, and very briefly, I will not be able to elaborate about this, but that there are some people, at least one segment of these communities which are which have integrated, you can say, into modern economy, and they have white collar jobs, etc. And there is a certain amount of differentiation in these groups as in any other groups in India. And this is a group which is also very vocal about seeking caste-based reservation. So there is reservation again, that these people do have reservation, but they don't have a separate category. So there is a lot of politics around reservation, which probably comes from this segment, which has been able to get educated and are in need of getting integrated, also better integrated into the modern white collar jobs. So there is a lot of that, which I can't talk in details. But there is another segment again, which is not necessarily, which has no stake, I think, or very little stake in reservation, because they don't even have basic documents like Aadhaar cards, voter cards, BPL cards, etc. And a lot of these documentations are based on, have a, you can say, sedentary bias. And so there are, in fact, with the Citizenship Amendment Acts or the National Population Registers, etc., these sort of things, there are a lot of apprehensions about how these people would be able to secure their position, because a lot of them actually totally fall outside any kind of state outreach due to lack of such documentation. And most recent, you can say, example of this is their exclusion, likely exclusion from the COVID-19 vaccination drive, right? So there are, so far whatever I have said is just the first part of my paper, is that, there are a lot of issues around their identities. Many of these issues have become compounded by new, you can say, political interventions like these new commissions. New technologies have also created new conditions. The pandemic is doing another set of things. There's a lot of, things going on, and a lot of documentation needs to be done. Now, if I turn to talking about the gender questions in these communities, I need not say that such questions really are not central in discussions about these communities, and that should not surprise us, because this is very common in any case, vis-a-vis most other groups also. But very briefly, I would like to talk about this. Despite the fact that we don't know so much about how these things work here, there is, you can say, a sort of good, you can say, set of understanding that there is a lot of, you can say, male dominance and patriarchy and, following the codes of honor, etc., in these kinds of communities. There is not much of an economic basis to a differentiation between men and women. In fact, in many such communities, women are as much part of the economic, uh, earning livelihood as the men. But still, this is the sort of thing. And there are some reasons that we can attribute to this kind of, gendered nature of these communities. I would say the closely knit character of these groups, their ghettoized conditions of living, very strong sense of separation and marginality, insecurities vis-a-vis the larger society contributes towards making them, invest in male domination. The absence of other domains which would affirm their sense of self also makes for an exaggerated investment in a masculine identity. Plus, many of these DNT groups, as I've also shown with respect to the Bedias, they align themselves with Rajput and Kshatriya groups. And this further contributes to this aspiration for a macho kind of an identity. Right. So there are many manifestations of this kind of alignment or with, the idea of male honor and pride, etc. So for instance, there are expressions of outrage at how women are represented in nomadic women are represented in art or films. Very recently, there has been a controversy around representation of the Banjara women in a Marathi novel by a Gyanpith Award winner, Marathi writer, Bhalachandra name this. So this kind of thing of, even if reports mention that women in this such and such group are involved in sex work, this is also seen as an affront. So this is, I think, needs to be understood against the backdrop of such an investment in the idea of male honor. The other side of this is also, of course, that women of such groups are actually subject to a lot more, sexual overtures, harassment, insults, especially from other dominant groups. And there is the hostility between DNT groups and the sedentary populations always has this kind of, you can say, under-sexualized undercurrent. It's very common. And, sometimes this takes very ugly forms of, massive kind of outrage of women, rape and, killings, etc. But it's also part of the routine relationship that these communities have with each other. So this is the other side of this, picture. And I would like to argue that this sort of, two-sided picture that men invest in this kind of ideology and women are, likely to be at the receiving end of this sort of violence, etc., creates conditions for us to then, see what are the characteristics of gender relationships within these communities. So as a counter to the prevalent views about the lax morality or sexual availability of their women, the nomadic communities tend to be very strict about restricting the freedom and independence of their women. And so they're very sensitive about the perception of their women. And in fact, and the other extreme, what may seem like another extreme of this is that are then what I've studied, let's say the Bedia kind of communities, where provision of sexual services by women to men of other communities has turned into a highly organized livelihood strategy. But what I would like to argue is that what may seem like these very different responses are actually part of a single overall ideological framework. And even though it seems it is actually, it turns out very differently, but the justification or the way it works is not something very different or radically apart from each other. So in fact, if time permits, I would like to talk a little bit about Bediyas. But before I do that, I want to talk about the institution of the Jati Panchayat among these people, among a host of denotified communities and nomadic groups, which among other things serves to enforce strict gender norms among these people. So although these groups, these kind of bodies don't have any statutory status, they are known to play such a role even among other castes such as Jats, etc. And most of the times it's the closely knit communities that are likely to follow the diktats of such bodies. And this also happens because of lack of alternative means of redress and also the fear of losing the belonging to such a group, because social boycott is a very common sanction in these kind of communities. So there's very little documentation again about functioning of such bodies among DNT communities, but they are known to play an active role even currently. And in fact, these tend to be entirely male dominated bodies, and they have the power, de facto power, to extract huge fines as well as enforce many coercive and humiliating sanctions, and including social boycotts, as I said. So in my own study of the Bedia, I found that the Jati Panchayats play a significant role. I can talk a little more about what these kind of panchayats are later on. So they enforce community norms among the Bediyas, which are part and parcel of this sort of institutionalized familial prostitution. So for example, among the Bediyas, there is an unwritten rule that if a Bediya woman forges a long-term economic relationship with a patron, no other woman should have a relationship with that man. And if this expectation is violated by another Bediya woman, the transgressing woman has to face the panchayat, and if her guilt is proven, she may have to pay a very heavy fine. There are other kind of similar kind of things like incest or an injury on a working woman, etc., which can also invite the panchayat. So these panchayats are also active in other communities. So for instance, recently, the role of such a panchayat has come into public attention for enforcing virginity tests in some communities. And there is evidence, you can say, that such a ritual has existed among such communities, though we don't know very much about it and how extensive it is, we don't know. But of course, this kind of a ritual is also a sign of disproportionate anxiety over women's sexual purity. So what happened around 3 years ago is that this became a very controversial issue reported in press when a soon to be married couple belonging to Kanjar Bhat community revolted against this custom. And this created a lot of tension in their community. And even though they were successful in defying the community, they face social boycott then, and they continue to face social boycott. And it came to light when this controversy was going that there was at least one much older couple who had similarly defied the community many years ago, and they still continue to face boycott by their community. So I had a conversation with the young man who had started this defiance, and he told me that there are only very few people who have had the courage to take this step of defying the community even after his case. And the point is that there is a sort of, you can see, an intergenerational schism over such customs that seems to be coming up. But it's also the case that very few people are able to break away from the community, or they have to assume that they'll have to break away if they defy the community. And this ostracism is a big fear. In my own work, again, on the Bediyas, the social reformers who emerged from among the Bediyas also shared with me the very oppressive, you can say, role that the caste panchayat can play in not letting anybody go out of the ambit of the expectations of the community panchayat. And so Ram Sanai was one such reformer among the Bedias. He's no more. He died about 8 years ago. And I've written about him. So he talked about, how he had to really struggle against the panchayat. So this is an old sort of thing, but it's still very much there. So the Kanjar Bhat example also shows that there is the continued marginalization and isolation of these people also plays a role in perpetuation of such customs and institutions. So in fact, in such, even those who become educated, for instance, sometimes do not necessarily defy the community. And that is also because they are not necessarily assured of a alternative social group to fall back upon, even if they are getting a job, etc. So this yet another aspect of this is that greater control over women is equated with upward mobility in Indian context and maybe elsewhere also. And people believe that, in fact, some people within these communities also believe that educated people have contributed to sometimes hardening the traditions and even by codifying them into written rule books, which did not exist in the past. So another study of like Dholis, another group from Rajasthan, also suggests that panchayats of such upwardly mobile segments of these groups can be instrumental in enforcing greater seclusion of women and withdrawing them from public performances, etc. I believe a lot more research needs to be done on the role of such communities in enforcing such norms within the communities, and also in seeing how such bodies are actually responding to the larger pressures to which these communities are subject. Now, I can see that I've already exceeded the time and I haven't actually spoken at all about the Bedias, but this is something that I've already written about. And unless people feel that I have time to go on, maybe I should stop here now. Anna.
How about 5 minutes on the Bedias?
That's a bit of a tall order, but okay, I'll try this, Okay, so I really wanted to briefly discuss the gendered aspect of the Bedia community, which of course I'm most familiar with. And they're not representative of DNT communities in many respects, but it is interesting to see how, despite their dependence upon sex work, they continue to adhere to ideologies of gender and male honor, which are common among other DNT communities. And so in a way, my findings about them challenge this idea that they are like exceptional communities. So here I would like to say something about the institutionalized, prostitution among the Vedias briefly, just very quickly. So, this is the sort of thing that within a Bedia family, a woman can be either a wife or a sex worker. That means either she's married to a Bedia woman or she's the daughter or sister of a Bedia man who will not marry but will engage in sex work. She can't be both. She can only be one thing, right? So in this picture, of two sisters and a child bride, this is a sort of common picture for a Bedia family. So there is a kind of close relationship between their kinship structure and familial prostitution. And I've written so much about this, I don't want to go over this. And my argument is that in order to look at their gender relationships, we need to think of both Bedia wives and the unmarried Bedia women. And both of them are subject to very norms of different kinds. So it's not like one is free and the other is, oppressed. In their own different ways, both are subjected to very strict regimens. So just as an example, when I was doing field work, I was, recurrently, I would be told by people that we are very strict. So it's a kind of an anecdote that in our community, if a married woman talks with a male outsider, we will cut her, finger. Even if she looks at a person, we'll, burn her eyes. Even if she points to something, we will take a very strong action. So this kind of a story was told to me again and again and again and again. And basically the point is that they want to convey to the outside world that we are very strict in the way in which we deal with the women who are, you know, our wives. In fact, they would constantly say, maybe in your communities, people can do all this. You are roaming around here like this. Our women will not do this. We are very strict. So this thing, you know, and so there is a lot of, you know, discussion that I have done of this in other places, that there are various purposes that this kind of thing serves. It keeps, of course, these women under control. So they are like these domesticated, unpaid wives, providing their labor to their families, but it's also something which has an ideological purchase for outsiders like us or the larger world, who are told, look, Bedias are very, very strict about how they deal with their women. Now, this should, however, not, of course, this can't be done with the women who are engaged in sex work, but they are subjected to another set of controls. So there is a whole, you can say, system within which, you know, women, through which women can enter such a trade and not otherwise. And in fact, if they don't want to, if they are not willing to enter the trade, they must prove that they are pure, you know, they are really like good women. So in a way, what I wish to argue is that there is a kind of, you know, okay, let me just read this last part of my paper, which I feel might convey to you, and other things I can tell you later on. That one of the ways I think that one can look at their gender structure is to see it as a microcosm of the broader patriarchal framework, in which women's sexual conduct underpins their identity in a way that does not apply to men. In such a framework, the ideal of appropriate femininity is constructed in opposition to its contrary, that is inappropriate femininity, with sexual conduct as a measure of this division. So in a patriarchal society, honor codes require enforced conformity to appropriate femininity from women who belong to one's own community, so these virginity rituals, etc. Whereas the inappropriate conduct is identified with the other women who may belong to another caste, class, community, or nation. Now, in contrast to this widespread pattern, the peculiarity of the Bedias consists in their having reinstituted this distinction within their own community. And I believe that the coexistence of these two very opposed demands from women within the same set of people is a striking vindication of the fact that these are really two sides of the same coin. Undoubtedly, in its Bedia variant, this involves a somewhat drastic reordering of the family structure, but it is really not possible to see this as outside patriarchal controls over female sexuality. And it doesn't really question these controls. So while the Bedias cannot be seen as presenting the paradigm of gender relations among the DNT at large, this persistence of patriarchy and honor codes, even though it's so much at odds with women's engagement in sex work, does give us a clue about the significance of investment that DNT communities make in such ideologies. And what I want to argue is also that the conditions of extreme marginality reinforce such trends among DNT communities, and also the nascent attempts at upward mobility further reinforce them, because these kind of values are associated with lifestyle of upwardly mobile groups. And finally, I would like to reiterate that we need many more studies which examine how social marginality shapes gender relations and ideologies among such groups. Thank you very much. I would like to stop here. I have taken more time than I should have. Let me stop sharing just a second.
Thank you so much. I was looking for my reaction button, but we don't have it. I was wanting to sort of clap and so on. Thank you so much. That was a incredibly wide-ranging, informative, very interesting talk. I would have so many questions and comments, especially about issues of, you know, performers and cultures and identity, but I don't want to hog the question. So Please, our audience, please do put questions in the Q&A for Anuja, and yes, and let's start a discussion. Very interesting to see, since I was last immersed in this, which was more like 10 years ago, that there's all the new, you know, the stuff online, these community groups, and perhaps more public advocacy for upward mobility and rights. It's very, very interesting. Is that a...
Yeah, I think a lot more research needs to be done because a lot of new things are going on. There's a lot of turmoil, I think, among these groups. And that is something that we need to be observing very closely. And also participating in, actually, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember trying to read anything I could about these groups when I was researching the performers who were very strongly connected, and there was just so little. Now we have a couple of questions.
I can see some questions.
Yes.
Yes. Would you like me to respond?
Yes, Suzanne Hanchett. Let me, if you would like to speak out.
Okay, up to you.
We can, yes. So you can put on your mic and you can put on your video if you'd like to speak out your question. That would be lovely. Otherwise, we can do it.
So,
hello, hi. We can see you and hear you.
Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I've seen these people in Karnataka where I also did fieldwork long ago, but I was curious by one of the things you said at the beginning, that this may not be a jati. There may be some other way to understand this group. I'd like to hear a little more about that.
So, see, I'm not saying that they are not like a jati, or I'm not saying that, but to treat each of the names of these people that we come across as a discrete caste will be a mistake, because they have a lot of relationships with each other, including relationships that normally we don't see as between people from different castes. So most particularly the relationship of marriage, for instance. So there may, this assumption that the caste groups are occupationally, hereditary occupational groups which are endogamous will not apply to these people in the way in which we normally assume. So for instance, I was talking about the Bediyas. Now Bediyas do not marry off their daughters at all, because most daughters will remain engaged in sex work. So the whole question of, you know, how do the men marry? Now the fact is that most Bediyas, at least in the groups that I looked at, marry nut women or Kanjar women, and they don't see it as it's not an intercaste thing as far as they are concerned. So at some level, this is a larger biradari, you know, they would, so basically there are different levels. So occupationally, they may be very different from the nuts or other groups, but they would have the relationship of marriage. They would have a common panchayat. They would see themselves as, so I'm just cautioning against treating these as discrete entities which are, you know, isolated from each other. They're not. Of course, this is something which needs to be gone into in far more detail than we have. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that is the point I'm trying to make. So so it can be misleading to call them a caste. It can be also misleading to call them a tribe, which they are often also referred to as, because these terms carry their own baggage in.
Is there a reservation? Is there a name in a list of reserved groups that applies to these people, or no? You said there was some problem with the reservations.
Right. So that is the, see, once these people were denotified, once India became independent, so initially we had reservations for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and then other backward classes. Now those who belong to DNT groups and NT groups are in these different categories. So they are in SC, somewhere they are in ST, they are in OBC, sometimes they are in no group, sometimes the same group is in different categories, even within a state. So it is, they don't have in some states there is a separate Vimukta Jati category, but it's a very small, category over there. By and large, they don't have a separate category. And this is a very political issue. It's a very, complicated issue. There is no one specific, of course, increasingly there is this demand that there should be a separate category for DNTs as a whole. But you can imagine that this is very politicized issue. And from every part of the country, because reservations is also a state subject, so in every part of the country, there are different demands. This is also something which needs to be documented. It's very much there in journalistic literature, but we don't have academic analysis of this so far.
Thank you.
So
we have a question from Amy Kathleen Gerald's boy. Amy, please, if you'd like to.
Right, this is the, so I should not talk too much about Kalbelia nuts because I haven't actually done my own research with them, but from the little that I have, I know about them, and also from the Bedia case, because Bedia women also perform and so on. So it's even if this happens, it doesn't mean that men, these communities become women dominated or women actually acquire a kind of position within their families that would reflect this aspect of their engagement. So that is one thing, that these household of such communities still remain very male dominated. That is the other thing is that even when there is this kind of engagement, there is a lot of shame often attached to this. The people who they would, so even if those whose families are not involved, they would actually say, we are not so badly off that we'll make our women dance in the public. So even if they do very well, these are contradictions really. Even if they do very well and this is their only means of sustenance, they would still see this as not very respectable. And this has happened in many communities, that where they then acquire upward mobility, they want to withdraw from this kind of thing because they see it as shameful. This is very common among large segments of these communities. They don't take pride on it, or sometimes they do, sometimes they do take pride on it, but it's a very sort of, you can say it's not an unambiguous thing. There is ambiguity about it.
Yeah. Thank you.
And from a question from Sagar De about the Bhatu and Beria. I'm assuming
no, Sagar, this would not be. This is not easy to say, is it? And Bhatu is an identity. What I'm saying is this is something that people need to really document and see how they are. So this is not about everyday life. No, this is about identity. This is about posturing, right? So I don't think this kind of thing straight away translates into this changed circumstances at the level of standard of living. How can it? It can't, right? So shall I read the second part of your question? In what way the boycott affects the lives of? Yes, of course. So not only boycott helps is a very devastating thing because they cannot participate in any community activity. They cannot attend any wedding. They are not even allowed to attend the funerals of their own relatives. They are literally cut off from every aspect. They are not visited by other people. So it takes a lot of courage to do this. Courage in the sense it's not just a one-time thing. It's a acceptance that for a long time I'm not going to have all of this. I'm not having the support of my community. I don't have a community to belong to. So it takes very many forms.
I was just going to add, there's a nut a woman I met who was a bar dancer in Bombay who had escaped the village or the hamlet community-based sex work, and she had written her autobiography, and that was blocked by the caste panchayat. I mean, it would have been just the most incredible story, you know, and she'd done so well in Bombay, and you know, that was before the dance bar ban. But yeah,
right.
It's all there.
Yeah,
I actually have a copy, but it's not, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There are many instances of people speaking out and or even complaining, let us say, when it comes to, for instance, the Jati Panchayat, going to the police, but then subsequently withdrawing because of the pressure. And the pressure comes also from the own family because they also fear. It's not just you who will face the boycott. It is anybody who shows any support to you who can face the boycott. So this whole boycott thing is a problem because, and this is, I think this is to do with then the close character of the community. The more it's, you know, sort of, you know, it's not got any other cross-cutting ties, you know, the more you're dependent on a single set of people, the more they are likely to enforce their whatever rules. You know, it can, sometimes it can be good things, but it can also be such things which are very oppressive. So in that sense, I think unless there is a better integration in the mainstream or, you know, so actually the only people who are able to defy are those people who can afford to defy. You have to be able to afford to defy. And they also, it's not like they don't suffer despite being able to afford.
Yeah, a question from Ludwig Pesch.
Just, okay, sorry. Is this restricted to, or maybe draw amongst? The young convert. Yeah, see, there could be, we could draw parallels with the Devadasi thing, but the difference over here is that we don't have this kind of elaborate religious system behind this. So even so, parallels are often drawn between these kind of groups. And I think there are a lot of parallels, frankly, but I think the parallels are more in terms of the way it operates at the level of the family, right? So I'm not very familiar with the example that you are giving here, so I cannot comment on that. But yes, there are parallels that we can draw.
And Vinay Brandon.
Okay.
All these questions are in the Q&A.
So I do not have any evidence that something like what you're suggesting has happened, Vinay. Also because these people are not likely to be, these are not the women who are likely to be contesting panchayat elections and winning them. They are not even integrated in the village structures. They are, in Rajasthan, there are instances of Kalbelia community, in fact, not even having a burial land. Like some of these communities are known for burying their dead. So it's a harrowing story, but they've had to bury their dead inside their homes because the villagers would not allow them any burial land, right? So there is, you know, this is something which is, it's a very far cry for them to be gaining from this kind of political representation. They're not. I don't think so.
Bharat has just suggested, which is a good point, actually, I hadn't thought of that, we should read out the questions so that they're for the sake of the recording.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So, but I'll leave you to do that, Anuja.
Okay.
Or people, as we unmute and put the camera on, you can also read out your own question. But perhaps it's better, Anuja, if you do that as they are
okay.
appearing.
Okay.
That takes a little bit.
Right. So Nikita has asked, can you please highlight the ways in which Brahminical patriarchy plays a role in violence experienced by women? So Nikita, this is of course like a 100% the case that there is a role that Brahminical patriarchy plays. The very fact that the women of such communities are expected to be available to men of upper castes is a consequence of, or you can say is an expression of Brahminical patriarchy, right? So the point that I have tried to elaborate over here, I mean, this is well known that women at the you can say lower end of this kind of a hierarchical society are treated in a way that they are available to the men of upper caste, but vice versa is not the case. But the point is how in some of these communities this also becomes something which is internalized. That is what I have been trying to also argue, and it's a response to their position in the larger society, which is very problematic. So Mayuri, I have read about Vedias and other deity called Pernas in some limited mainstream media, which also usually mentions the part about institutionalized prostitution. However, these articles also say that the British were the ones who classified the Vedias as criminal tribes post their role in 1857 mutiny, and then our constitution did not do much to change. There are such historical evidence of how the Vedias came to be the way they are, culminating in the issues they face. So yes, Mayuri, the one thing is, of course, that as I also said when I was talking about this, that actually Vedias got notified, I think only in 1912 perhaps, but they were not notified in 1871. And a lot of what you read in journalistic reports is not historically accurate. But of course, Vedias were in the, you can say, colonial, they were very much under their surveillance for from a very long time. And we can only, there is only so much we can say on the basis of the literature that is available. If you read my book, because this isn't something that I can explain to you very quickly, but if you read the book that I have written on this, you would find some clues as to how we can understand this whole transition. And in fact, my argument is that this is, if you look at the Criminal Tribes Act, prostitution was not criminalized. And a lot of Vedias, in fact, at that time claimed that we engage in prostitution. And that was a way of trying to escape the Criminal Tribes Act by saying we are doing something legitimate, right? So it is a mistake to see them as having been criminalized due to engagement in prostitution. That was in fact even taken as a justification for not being included in that. So all of that is something, whatever, such evidence is there, has been documented. I would suggest that maybe you should look at that.
We don't have any other questions coming up right now. So Amy. Okay, Amy, I'm just going to jump in ahead of you, if you don't mind. I know Amy well, so hopefully she won't mind. I wanted to just comment a bit, but also kind of will draw the discussion further into the performers, because there is a whole sector within DNTs who are performers. Itinerant performers. But the interesting thing is, we think of, sapiras and so on, and kalbeles, they've done very well in recent decades, but these performers actually extend to very elite performers. And I mean, I came into contact with DNTs, Denotified Tribes, because I started this project on Bollywood dance. I mean, it sounds extraordinary. You start a project on Bollywood dance and you end up, in a hamlet in Rajasthan, where this, and that was because there were bar girls. Most of a good proportion of the bar girls were from these communities. So it's very interesting to see. And I'm thinking of Saba Devan's recent, just phenomenally good book on the Tawais. She's talking about a lineage of elite Tawais, and she unpacks in quite a lot more detail that they are a kind of nut. So I'm interested to see there is some consciousness you've been talking about of, the Sapiras. India's represented through the Sapiras and these kinds of very interesting kind of folk arts. Yet we are neglected and ignored. But it's not just the folk arts; it goes into the classical arts. And I met people in the Nut who they knew ragas. They were in the middle of Rajasthan. They spoke Urdu. The men folk as well used to be performers. But I'm just wondering if there's any consciousness. I was longing to do follow-up work of this, and it didn't happen for many reasons. But any consciousness of their involvement in so-called high culture, which has now become an upper caste, largely Hindu, Brahmin preserve, these classical arts, because it really does span, and some of these communities, some have been more successful, so I'd be interested to hear you comment on this.
So I only know about the Bedias in this particular respect, and there are, if you meet some of the older Bedias in some areas, like, so for instance, in the Bundelkhand area of Madhya Pradesh, or if you are in the Morena district of Madhya Pradesh again, I met some very old women who were trained classical Kathak dancers, very, I would say, cultured, and who really saw themselves as artists and performers. But increasingly, you don't come across, among the younger segment, you do not come across that kind of trained people. At least I did not. And there is a much, you can say, larger segment which has never had that kind of you can say exposure. But and so there is also this sort of a stratification, you can say, within these communities, where people who are with that kind of a classical training and background actually don't see the form that this has now taken among other segments of this broader community. I mean, they dissociate from that. They also say that this is not, they are not real Bedia, they are something else. That also happens. I mean, this is also part of this whole discussion of who's who. And somewhere in the middle of my field work, somebody said, those are not Bedias at all that you're working on, and can you imagine, what, but I figured out that this is a very, this sort of thing about who is who. And so this idea that Bedias are some Bedias say we are the real Bedias and others are not the real ones. This is something which happens in the context of this kind of association with a slight higher culture and low culture. But it is really something which has declined massively. And, I think it's massively declined, and that sort of a thing. So there is Rai dance, etc., which is also, Rai dance is not so much like a high culture. It's also like a folk dance. And it's a rural, it's a rural kind of, dance which exists. And it's also showcased as part of the these ICCR shows, etc.
I think this happens. Is what really intrigues me, is that maximum these sorts of groups can be seen in terms of folk dance, folk art, but actually they were part of, these things were interconnected. Folk and classical were only, connected, and actually they were part of classical. I mean, if you look at before, Brahmin women, upper caste women were involved, the era of the courtesans, the wife, and of course, quite fairly similarly, the Vidasis. So, so there are even, larger questions of heritage, so it's interesting to hear that you're saying that there is a consciousness in the communities, but they themselves now are very marginal and very old.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
I think Professor Gupta wants to ask a question.
And then Amy as well, who I bombed out the way. Akil, please.
All right. So thank you for that wonderful talk. My question had to do with two interrelated parts. It's the same question, but two aspects of it. One of which has to do with the whole question of the rise of, Dalit organizing and political power, etc., It's taken a long time, but it's finally happening in India. And then there's the question of all of these other groups, like the groups you're talking about, who are sometimes included, sometimes not. They're at the margins of what is considered Dalit, and they themselves might not consider themselves Dalit, and so forth. And I just wonder whether there is, in fact, some kind of intersectional politics that's arising in which people see themselves as simultaneously similar to, but yet different from these groups with whom they must make common political cause. And if so, what form that is taking. And the related question has to do with Indian sociology. And, we have Indian sociology has a long history of looking at caste, and much of it was about relations between upper castes and lower castes. And then kind of the study of caste wasn't going anywhere for a while, and then it got reanimated with the interest in Dalit politics and so forth. And so now I'm wondering, what is the status of people who are studying caste, particularly because there is a recognition that there are more Dalit scholars in academia who might be studying their own caste, or, in other words, it's not now Brahmin scholars looking at caste relations between castes. And so how has that changed? How sociology itself is thinking about caste?
Okay, so I think that second part is a very big question. I don't know whether I can or should really be able to respond to that. See, as far as this question about relationship with broader Dalit politics is concerned, I think for a large, long time, whatever issues these people had, which became, I think, public, did get subsumed within the broader Dalit politics. But I think there is a lot of, at least small scale evidence that the two kind of don't see really each other as, I mean, the Dalits may also look down upon these communities, and these communities also look down on the, untouchable caste. So there is, for instance, in many parts of the country where these communities are included in the SC, they don't want to be in the SC category, they want to be in the ST category. And part of it is that, apart from, there are other reasons for it, but it's also that they don't see themselves as, and I've written on this in another context, that there is this idea of we have a high caste origin, we are Rajput, we are Kshatriya. This is very, very common, and this is something which has been documented for many groups in, this is the most commonly associated upper caste identification of many such groups, but this is particularly the case among these groups. So now, subsequent to these commissions being set up, the Renke Commission, I think, was in that sense a kind of a watershed for these people, because for the first time, they have a separate body looking into their issues. And I think, though this hasn't really been documented, I think, very well, but since I started looking at some of these groups when, as a larger set, I mean, I had been working on Bedias, but as a larger set when this Idate Commission had been set up, and I saw a lot of mobilization by these people around that time, which doesn't include really the larger Dalit communities or their political groups, etc. Even in these groups, you would have Ambedkar, you would have all those symbols of, you can say, Dalit politics, not necessarily universally, like, so it's a very heterogeneous political formation, really very much more heterogeneous than I would say the Dalit politics. So you have all the way from, RSS and, religious bodies. And it's also because it's also got, there are Muslim DNTs also. It's so much more heterogeneous that you can almost probably find every possible sort of persuasion, political persuasion being expressed over here. But there is, I don't see that kind of alliance coming in, because it's also about, I think, this reservation issue. In a lot of this kind of politics, it's the reservation issue which becomes, and over there, I think then there are a lot of, tensions then, because some of these groups are asking for a pie from the reservation meant for some other group, whether it's OBC or it could be SC or it could be ST. So
Right.
I think I don't see that kind of, like, for instance, there is this Atrocities Act, which is there for SCs and STs. Now, all DNTs do not get covered under the Atrocities Act. There's a very large chunk of DNTs who are in OBC category, and OBC is not covered by the Atrocities Act, right? So there is, so I don't see the Dalit community saying that, look, there should be inclusion of these people in the Atrocities Act. This is a demand. So their demands are also different. Like, they want Habitual Offenders Act, or many of those kind of things for which they are disproportionately subject. So this is something which happens. Now, for instance, now a lot of them are in the SC group. Now, if you look at this is one of the things, I think Nikita is also here. She's working on this project that I mentioned earlier. If you look at the prison population, you try to see the caste-wise breakup, you will only write it according to SC, ST, OBC, and you will say, oh, it's overrepresented by SCs. But then within those SCs, which SCs are overrepresented, we don't know. And it's likely that there are more DNT people in that category. So I think it's a bit messy over there for Dalits to now make a common cause with DNTs. Maybe, other people could say something about this over here, but I think they do need a separate voice, or, they need better recognition. And while they invoke all those symbols of Ambedkar and so on, I don't think they are on the same page. And I think I'll not answer the other question, which I don't know. It's a big question, Professor Gupta. And so, but you're very right that there is a big turn over here that, is happening in these kind of things. Studies of caste are really now different. But unfortunately over here, I think, again, not that much coming from DNT communities as should or is required. So I think this is a more very marginal among the marginal, and invisible. That is the problem. And invisibility in India is so much because of lack of official categories, neat categories. And that's what they've been asking for. So you can see why they want that. It makes sense. They don't even have a commission which is permanent. Like, so that's another demand. We want a permanent. So there's an SC commission, ST commission, but there's no permanent DNT commission. It's these temporary things which don't help. So they do feel shortchanged with respect vis-a-vis other communities.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I'm thinking we should be wrapping up, but there are two questions, perhaps one from Amy, and then Amy Catlin, and then one from Anjana Acharya. So maybe just we can be brief.
Yeah, any songs referring to the practice of prostitution among barriers? No, I did not come across any such song. I actually could not come across very much historical sort of materials. And this could also be because of the segment of the Bedias where I did my field work. Maybe another set of Bedias might have had more of this. There wasn't so much of this sort of, there was more of this commercial prostitution among them, even though they could historically link to people who were not so commercially involved in this trade. So it could be also a bias of the specific location of my fieldwork, but I did not come across this. And Anjana, since the reason for the marginalization is to a large extent a non-enumeration in the census data, is there a chance of their enumeration in census by any chance? See, no, I'm not saying that it's only because of not being enumerated in census data. It's also the Criminal Tribes Act. It's, you know, it's stigmatization in so many different ways. It's being divided into different categories, etc. So this is a demand. They want to be, that there should be census, caste census. There was a caste census in 2011, but its you know, findings were not made public. It's a very contentious issue because every community wants a new representation according to its numerical strength, and this is like a Pandora's box. So I don't think it's likely that such a thing will happen. But you know that, see, some of them are in SCs and STs, so that census happens. So we have numerical records of those those who belong to SC and ST, because a caste-wise census does occur for them every 10 years. The other groups who are in OBC or who are in no group, for them there is no census and there is a demand. I'm not sure whether that demand is going to be fulfilled. I don't think so. It's already happened and they're not made the results public.
Thank you so much, Anuja. I think we have, it's time to wrap up. Yeah, it's the middle of the night. It's been absolutely fantastic. What a wonderful talk. So interesting, so much food for thought. And I hope more people will be working on this. I really, really do.
I do.
On so many levels, it crosses through so many important issues, cultural, social justice, so on and so forth. Thank you so much. And stay safe.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Well, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.